The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, a podcast bringing you timely interviews with industry experts from pharma, biotech, medical devices, and life science manufacturing. Each week, we discuss trending topics and industry best practices. This week, we are pleased to have with us Chris Wubbolt. Chris has been here with us before, and he's the principal of QACB Consulting and a 25-year veteran of the industry. And today we are talking about staying compliant with compliant product complaint handling systems. That's a mouthful, Chris. Welcome, though, today. I'm excited to talk about this topic with you.
Thanks, Stacey, and I'm glad to be back. This is my second podcast, and I enjoyed the first one, and I'm looking forward to this one also.
Yes, likewise. You always bring so much great information in the computer systems validation space, and we have a lot of listeners who, rely on this type of information to learn about new systems, and this is certainly something. This is a type of system we haven't talked about before on this podcast. So it's great to bring new information their way.
That sounds great. I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent. Thanks. So we're going to dive right in, Chris, and let you talk about the complaint handling systems. Customer complaints come with the territory when selling products, and whether it's candy bars or medical devices, right? So pharma and biotech are no different. But when, in terms of having complaints come in, but when dealing with compliant products, such as medical devices, pharmaceuticals, and other things like that, there are very defined systems which need to be in place. So can you give us an overview of the type of systems and the current requirements impacting them?
Sure. So there are many different types of quality management system software applications that are out there that provide the capability to manage product complaints and the investigations that are associated with those. And so the key for that is that most of these systems can be configured in many different ways, and the systems really need to be configured and based upon solid workflows within the organization. Because if you have a product complaint process that does not meet regulatory requirements as defined in 21 CFR Part 211 for pharmaceuticals or 21 CFR 820 for quality system regulations, then you can have the best quality management system software out there, but if the workflow doesn't reflect the compliance requirements or it's not efficient, then that quality management system, electronic quality management system software that you're implementing may not necessarily be put you into compliance. So it's really important to have a really solid process that you ultimately then automate as part of your complaint handling system. Again, there are a lot of good systems that are out there. There are a lot of systems that are out there. Some are better than others. Sure. And I still see some companies that are using access databases, for example, that they've custom developed to meet product complaint requirements. But those types of systems generally don't have the typical Part 11 types of requirements and controls that may be needed for that system to be compliant. So you need to have a good working process, so good workflows, if it's a manual system or an automated system. And then you need to have technology that allows that workflow and how product complaints are handled to be compliant also. And the one thing I wanted to mention about product complaint systems, it's an important element. It's an important quality system element that's part of the overall quality pharmaceutical and medical device quality management system. and it ties into things like adverse events, and they may be indicators of poor quality. It ties into the AQL process for um, release of product and things like that. So it's really an indicator of product quality, and it does tie into other areas such as I mentioned, adverse events and so forth.
Okay, so that makes sense. I mean, obviously, we know with the regulatory agencies that they are always looking for the process. Not just with product complaint handling systems, but really that's the number one thing they want. So that makes sense to me that you have to have the right workflow, your process defined ahead of time, and then the technology, as you mentioned. So how does whichever technology you end up selecting for your complaint handling system, how does it integrate with an existing quality management system if you already have one of those in place? And does it need to be managed by a separate implementation and monitoring team?
Well, a lot of quality management systems have capabilities to include a electronic quality management system software that you may use or purchase to help with your quality management system to manage it. What might include document management or training and other components such as handling investigations, nonconformances, as well as product complaints. So ideally, the best quality management system, the easiest for someone to implement would be a quality management system that includes a product complaint module and or capability to have a workflow for product complaints. But some companies they choose to have an LMS that they may be comfortable with, a learning management system software that is one part of their quality management system, and another for management of SOPs or other
Mm-hmm.
types of regulatory documents or electronic trial master files. And then they may need to sort of cobble together a product complaint system along with that. And when that happens, I think you can have a standalone product complaint handling system,
Yeah.
and I have seen that, but many times it helps to have that interface either through the same application that may be purchased from one of the vendors that are out there, or possibly an interface with other systems also. The thing about many of these electronic QMS systems, including product complaint handling systems, is that a lot of the vendors now are providing software as a service capabilities. So that means that they're hosting the software, and they can make changes if it's a multi-tenant environment, really whenever they want to that application to have upgrades and things like that. So if you do have a standalone product complaint system, and it might be managed through software as a service through another vendor, or it might be installed on premise at your facility. Whenever you have those upgrades 3 or 4 times a year through the software as a service process from some of the vendors, you have to really be concerned about the interfaces between two different applications being updated at the same time or at different times, and possibly having some disconnects or issues technically because of those interfaces. So ideally, you'd have an integrated quality management system from the same vendor, although that's not necessarily something that always happens, and you have to be aware of the risks associated with that.
Right. But certainly if you are looking at new systems, and upgrading everything, upgrading your quality management system at the same time, ideally you could select one that has that component built in, right? That seems to be the best option if you can do it that way.
Yeah, it's one of the options. But it is something that if you're starting from scratch, you might want to consider for ease of upgradability and reducing risk for changes to multiple computerized systems that are being updated. Really, sometimes outside of a pharmaceutical or medical device company's control, because it is software as a service.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what actually is a complaint, like what needs to be logged in the system in terms of regulatory standards. So what exactly constitutes a product complaint as far as the FDA is concerned, or PICS or one of the other regulatory agencies?
Okay. Well, the 21 CFR 211 that has a section on handling of product complaints, but it doesn't really have a definition.
Okay.
However, 21 CFR 820, which is the quality system regulations for medical devices, does have a definition for complaints, and it states that a complaint means any written, electronic, or oral communication that alleges deficiencies related to the identity, quality, durability, reliability, safety, effectiveness, or performance of the device. For pharmaceuticals would be, or biotech, it would be a product after it has been released, so in the market. So a product complaint really is any type of defect that may be associated with the product. Again, I just read the definition for complaint from a medical device perspective,
Mm-hmm.
but a product complaint could be something as simple as it's not only for the product, but it's also for any packaging and labeling that's associated with the product. So it could be a chip tablet, it could be
Okay.
a blister pack that's hard to open, it could be labeling that doesn't include all the required elements of the label. Um, so there's a lot of aspects of what could be a product complaint. A product complaint may also lead to an adverse event. So if someone takes a drug of some type and they're supposed to relieve their headache, but it doesn't, they could contact the company and state that the product is not working as expected. That would be a product complaint and also an adverse event. So those are things that need to be assessed, and complaints again are key indicators of the quality system. And sometimes product complaints that are received by companies, they actually may lead to further actions, so investigations and possibly a field alert and maybe a recall possibly in some cases. So I've been
Okay.
involved in a lot of product complaint issues that have come up over the years at various things that I've been involved in that have had direct interest by regulatory agencies that may have led to they didn't because of the investigation and the actions that were taken that I was involved in, but that may have led to in some cases global recalls because of product complaints that were received from a product. So they're really important, and the regulators they definitely will always look at that aspect of the quality system when doing an inspection.
Right. It's great. It's good. It's important to have detailed notes, right, and a trail of the types of complaints. I mean, because they may be one off, but then again, you may see a pattern depending on.
Oh, definitely, and that's something that you have to look for. You have to look for trends. So there could be by dosage form, it could be by packaging component type, and then you have to look at the specific lots that may be in question, and then also the lots that have been manufactured around those lots that the product complaints may have been received in for. And so you definitely have to do a trend analysis and and determine if there's a systemic type of an issue for that lot and also possibly other lots as well. So you have to if there is a problem, you have to find out what what the boundaries are for how far that issue may have occurred. Possibly there might have been a change of equipment, possibly, or
Sure.
there may have been a excipient supplier that may have made a change for raw materials, possibly that may have impacted the drug product, and so forth. So there's a lot of things that are part of that. Looking at the individual complaint and doing a in-depth investigation of the individual complaint is an important part of complaint management systems, but also then the trending, and that's why paper records for performing for documenting product complaints and so forth and doing the investigations, they're not really useful because and some companies still use paper records, but they're not really useful because you have to trend and then you have to go through all those paper records from sometimes dozens or hundreds of complaints, and that's really difficult to do.
It can be
And
very
that's why some
tedious and time consuming, I would think.
Oh yeah, and some companies they may say if they're using an Access database, for example, and again, I don't definitely don't recommend that, but they may
Right.
say, well, we're going to print these reports out from the Access database and sign them, and the paper record is the record, the official
Official
record,
record, yeah.
that's really not sufficient because all the trending is done in the database, and
Sure.
and the trend is just as important as the individual product complaint.
Understood. And so, as you mentioned just a few moments ago, with the product complaint handling systems being part of the overall quality management system or integrating with them in some way, and used in conjunction with post-market product surveillance or CAPAs, corrective and preventative action programs. Can you outline the different components, procedures, processes of the system that we would be looking for?
Sure. So I'll start on product complaints, and normally, so product complaints have to be received by the company, by the company that might be outsourced. A call center may actually receive complaints. It could be by telephone, it could be by email, it could be by letter.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, it could be through social media, and so forth.
Right.
Especially that's being
People like
looked
to
at
post
carefully.
that stuff.
They do, and especially for adverse events, FDA is looking at that carefully when social media is used to post at potentially adverse events for products, and they expect companies to investigate those. So the process to receive the complaint and then triage it. So that's normally then entered into a product complaint system. It could be an inquiry, which is a question about a product. That may be a question initially, but that may lead to an actual complaint that has to be entered into the system. And then the complaint, they should need to get as much information as you can about the complaint, and who provided the complaint, the
Of
lot
course.
number, the date of occurrence, the clear description of what the complaint is, if possible, obtaining the product complaint sample, so having that returned, and then in some cases evaluated. That's really useful, for example, when doing an investigation. So these complaints need to be investigated. Typically, and that should all be documented in the quality management system. All these aspects. There's usually a time period for completing a product complaint investigation, and some companies have 20 business days or 20 calendar days or 30 days that they are required to complete their investigation, and that's all documented. So that could include review of batch records. So that's how it connects to some of the quality system elements. By reviewing the batch records, it could require review of laboratory records. Again, another quality system element. It could require review of distribution records and so forth. So there's a lot of different things that can be reviewed to determine what the outcome of what the source of the complaint may be. If it's first of all, determine if it's a valid complaint, or if it's something that is truly may not be a valid or a confirmed complaint. Then, if the complaint is significant enough or serious enough, for example, an expiration date's not included on a label, then that may lead to further investigation, and then ultimately that could be a field alert possibly, which has to be issued within 3 days of a potential non-compliance. There's criteria for what is included in a field alert, and then and that could lead to a possible recall, as I mentioned as well.
Right.
But that not every product complaint ends up as a corrective or preventive action, but trends may possibly. If you have several product complaints of the same type, then that could lead to a CAPA because it's a trend.
Right.
And if it's significant enough, it could lead to additional actions by the quality unit. I've done lots of audits of manufacturing facilities and laboratories and so forth, and both internally and when there's CMOs that are involved to investigate product complaint issues, depending on if they're serious enough. So they all tie together, and that's, again, if it's integrated as part of a one quality management system software, then that's good. But you have to understand what the different components are and how they all relate together. If it's one system or multiple systems and some type of paper system that may be used as well.
So, and again, it comes to your point at the very beginning of this conversation, and it comes back to having that process in place. So no matter what systems you are using, as long as you know what you're looking for, how to track it, how to record it correctly, and then it should be working for you in the way that you intended it to, right?
That's right, and that's part of a validation process also.
Right.
But again, you validate processes, and so the computerized system is used as part of that process. And if the process is not very good or is inefficient, then you can validate that process, but it may not make you compliant.
Right. Right. So speaking of compliance, and I know, as you mentioned, you do a lot of audits. So as with all auditable systems, this product complaint system may be cited by regulatory when they come in to do a formal audit. What, in your experience, are some of the most common errors or omissions that companies are getting cited for?
Uh, I think primarily it would be related to most of the systems that are used, and most of the larger companies, and even small and mid-sized companies. They use systems that are capable of being Part 11 compliant. So I wouldn't say that they're necessarily findings around Part 11 compliance necessarily any longer, or not that often at least. But basically, it would be process related. So the complaint was received, it wasn't investigated properly, or the trend wasn't done, and so forth. So I would say process related issues are more likely to be cited for product complaints than technical issues related to those systems, unless it's clear that the system is just fully non-compliant and so forth. So
Like
again, access
outdated
database I
systems
mentioned.
potentially with
Yeah,
those.
yeah, possibly outdated systems, or systems that just um, uh, that haven't really been in the reports may be inaccurate, possibly if there are trend reports that are generated because they haven't classified their complaints properly. So, and you have different types of classifications for complaints in terms of the type of defect that may be identified and so forth. So, reports that are inaccurate or not complete, those are things that would be used as part of trending. And again, that's a process related issue, as well as in that case, if the computerized system generated reports are inaccurate, that is a technical issue, but normally they're related to some type of process deficiency, that the complaints haven't been investigated thoroughly, or they haven't been comprehensively evaluated for trends and things like that.
That makes sense. Definitely. And so it's all about the process. Um, in terms of you're either on top of it or you're not, and that sounds like where a lot of the findings come in. How in your experience, how can organizations overcome some of these challenges? I mean, obviously you talked about having the right process in place, but I know as that in so many instances, you may have the best process in place, but not everybody doesn't always follow it or doesn't follow it correctly. So in your experience, what do you think are some things that or companies can do to really try to avoid some of these issues?
Well, first of all, if you already mentioned it, it's robust processes
Right.
that are implemented and automated in an automated system of some type, and that automated system by itself actually helps you to stay in compliance if the process that you're automating is in compliance, and so forth. Also, but it's important for investigations to be thorough,
Mm-hmm.
and because that's what regulators look at when they do inspections. They look at investigations and the outcome and the adequacy of those investigations. I remember I was the product complaint manager for a company, and it was a global company, and I received a complaint investigation for facility in Europe, and I was reviewing their investigation for a product complaint that we had sent them, and their investigation actually referred to finishing the packaging line validation, and that led me to request, well, isn't the packaging line validation completed already? And it turns out that actually it was not completed, and but if I would have accepted that investigation from that packaging site without asking those questions, and that actually led to a CAPA as well. Then that, and the regulator reviewed that, that could have been a finding at that point. So thorough investigations and really challenging the investigations that have been completed, making sure that the documentation is in place to support the investigation, and also the actions that were taken to prevent the issue from reoccurring. One thing that I see many times in investigations is where the organization states that they're going to retrain personnel to do better QC checks and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
That really is providing training for personnel is really a very inefficient way to ensure that the issues don't reoccur. So those types of things should be looked at. If you see that more than once, then there's definitely a problem with not only the training process, but also the SOPs that are supposed to be clear to define the process, or possibly the technical controls that are in place. So, but the actual, where the rubber hits the road is where the investigation is documented and make sure it's comprehensive. And then that should be done by the internal product complaint team and whoever else is involved in that process. And then periodically having an external auditing group come in and just audit the product complaint process, just like you would any other quality system element, to make sure that looking at it at holistically, looking at the forest as well as the trees, to make sure that there aren't any gaps or there aren't any things that are occurring that may need to be addressed or looked into more carefully. And again, I mentioned several quality system elements with document management training, CAPAs, complaints, nonconformances. Audit findings also many times are incorporated into a quality management system, electronic QMS, and that may or may not be included or integrated with the product complaint quality management system software.
Excellent. Thank you. So, I mean, so there's a lot that obviously can go into the process, and it sounds like internal audits as well as external audits are good ways, like to check the investigations that you're doing on the different complaints and make sure that you haven't missed anything in the process. So your recommendations, Chris, what are your recommendations for our listeners on implementing a robust compliant product complaint handling system if they don't already have one? I know we talked a little bit about it at the beginning in terms of how it fits in with a possible existing quality management system. But do you have some recommendations or 2 or 3 highlights for the listeners that they should be looking for if they are planning to implement a system like this?
Yeah, again, I'll reiterate some things I mentioned previously, but really develop a sound, robust process for product complaints, investigations, and product complaint handling, as well as any quality system element, and really make sure that maybe you do some process mapping, maybe to ensure that you have a comprehensive process. Right. Understand how the product complaint process ties into other quality system elements, other types of investigations, CAPAs, audit findings, the field alert process, possibly the recall process, and so forth. It also goes back into manufacturing. So if you have AQLs, so you can allow for a certain number of chip tablets in a lot and still release it because they may not be considered critical defects possibly. So your manufacturing and AQL process allows you to release certain batches that have a certain number of chip tablets possibly. And then if you receive complaints that are for chip tablets, you really have to monitor that to see if that threshold that for complaints that you receive might not correlate directly to the AQL level. Acceptable quality level, that is, AQL level for the manufacturing process. So they tie in. You have to understand where all these things tie in together, have a robust standalone quality product complaint process that you then automate, and then you validate for a electronic system. Right. But understand where all the tie-ins are for all the product complaint, for all the other quality system elements that tie into the overall pharmaceutical quality system. I think that's really important to just have knowledge of the process and knowledge of the tie-ins to other key elements of pharmaceutical compliance.
And how often should internal checks be done to make sure that the process is in fact being followed and that the system is in fact working the way you intended? And I know it's validated at this point, but obviously there needs to be a series of checks and balances. And how frequently would we expect to be doing that kind of thing?
Yeah, I would expect at least annually there should be some type of audit of the product complaint process and maybe some tie-ins to other areas as well. And however, if you end up seeing an increase in product complaints in certain areas based on your trending that's done and so forth, product complaints also can tie into your APR process as well. If you see an increase in that, the review of the product complaint records may lead you to do an audit of other areas, maybe manufacturing areas and so forth, that to determine what are the causes of the spike in product complaints that you've received for this product or for this dosage form and so forth.
Right.
So I would say at least annually, and then possibly more depending upon the risk element in terms of based upon risk indicators, increased occurrence of complaints and things like that. It may not necessarily be an audit of the complaint process, but that product complaint process may lead you to conducting audits in other areas that the product complaints indicate there may be a quality problem occurring.
Sure. Yes, and it's all about analyzing the data, right, and reviewing what trends are in place. That makes total sense. Thank you so much, Chris. Some great information today on product complaint handling systems. I do appreciate that. Before we close, I just want to see if there's any last words of wisdom for our audience that we didn't touch upon yet during this episode.
Yeah, I think in general, this is how I look at everything, but look at, and product complaints is a good way to illustrate this, but look at both the forest and look at the trees. If you're looking at the individual trees, right, you may miss that other parts of the forest are burning or are bare. And if you only look at the forest without looking at the details, the individual trees, sometimes the individual branches of the tree, then you may miss really important indicators as well. So look at things holistically, take your time developing good, robust, solid processes, and make sure that those processes are implemented into these systems appropriately through a validation program. Because if you validate a bad process, you're going to be using that for a long time. It's a lot harder to change a validated bad process than it is electronically than it is on paper. So make sure you take the time to do it right the first time. That's what I would recommend.
Great advice, Chris. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the next one.
Yes, me too. Thank you to our producers, Ed Sullivan and Ben Kitchen, as well as our guest, Chris Wubbolt. Also, a big thank you to Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And I want to give a big shout out to all of you, our valued listeners. If you like Voices in Validation, we encourage you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice so you never miss an episode, and share it with your colleagues and online networks. For more information on the podcast and links from today's show notes, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with more great interviews. Until then, make it a great week.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.